So in managerial accounting, all costs can be separated into two different categories. So the first of which is the fixed costs and the variable costs, and the second of which is the period costs and the product costs. So one thing to note is that all costs are either fixed or variable costs. Therefore, the sum of those equal the total costs. And the same can be said for period and product costs. This also means that the fixed plus variable costs equal the period plus product costs. So now we're going to kind of jump into what are fixed costs and variable costs. So fixed costs are defined as costs that stay the same. The total cost stays the same whenever you change the number of units, but the per unit cost changes whenever you change the number of units. Whereas variable costs are the opposite. The total cost changes with a change in the number of units, whereas the per unit cost stays the same when you change the number of units. And I'll kind of draw those out to explain that. So when it comes to fixed costs, their total cost always stays the same. So if this is a total fixed cost, let's say it's rent, no matter how many units you produce, that rent or that total cost will always stay the same. But the per unit cost will change. So if you make 2 units, then that rent is going to be split up equally between the 2 units. Whereas if you make 4 units, that rent will be split up into 4 separate pieces. So as you see, the total fixed cost stays the same depending on the per units. However, the per unit cost changes depending on how many units you make. Now, variable costs are the complete opposite. So we're going to start down here. Now, let's say we're making tables. So the variable cost per unit will pretty much always be the same. So this is like the wood of the table and the screws that go into the table. However, so the variable cost per unit will always stay the same. However, if you make 2 units, it's going to go kind of the opposite way. The total variable cost will be twice the amount of per unit variable cost. And if you make 4 units, that total amount of variable cost will be 4 times the amount of per unit cost. And that shows that, again, fixed costs, their total cost does not change. However, their per unit cost changes depending on the number of units you make, and variable costs are the opposite. Their per unit cost stays the same no matter how many units you make. However, their total cost changes depending on how many units you make. Now, when it comes to product and period costs, which are the second way to categorize costs, product costs refer to any costs that are used to actually create a product, whereas period costs are referred to as costs that are not used to help create a product. So a simple kind of line I use to describe these is a product cost is a cost that's inside the factory, whereas the period cost is a cost that's outside the factory. And I'll kind of draw that out to make it make more sense. So let's say you have a factory. So this is your factory. And you have across the United States, or any country really, you have an administrative office. So every cost inside of this factory is going to be considered a product cost, because every cost in that factory will be used to create whatever product is in the factory. Whereas every cost found within the administrative office is considered a period cost. These costs are not actually used to help create the products. Otherwise, they would be shipped over to the factory. Rather, these are used to help sell the products or focus on new products and such. So some examples of product costs would be, let's say these are our tables. There'd be materials. There'd be people building the tables or our products. they'd be the lights of the factory, the rent, they'd be the people sweeping up the factory. Just literally everything inside of the factory is considered a product cost. Whereas the period cost would be, again, things that are not in the factory. So these would be the CEOs of the business, the lights of the administrative office, the rent of the administrative office, the janitors of the administrative office. These are all considered period costs because they're not actually helping build the product. So some special examples that don't really work with this, I'll note, are the delivery of raw materials. So the materials that you actually use to make the product that are shipped to the factory, and the delivery of the product itself to customers. So because you need the delivery of raw materials to the factory in order to assemble these products, they're considered a product cost, even though they're not technically inside the factory. Again, you need all of those costs to ship out the materials to the factory in order to assemble these tables. So they are considered a product cost. However, the delivery of products to customers isn't necessary to actually make these tables. In theory, you could throw the tables outside the door of the factory and sell them to customers, and people could pick them up, and it's still a complete table. So the delivery of the product to customers is considered a period cost. They're not crucial to construct the tables themselves. So those are just two small examples that you have to look out for. Now, one quick thing to note is that within product costs are three subcategories. So the first of which are the materials that are actually used in the table itself or the product itself. So in the case of the tables, this is the wood of the table, the legs of the table, and the screws of the table. So every material that is actually in the finished product itself, that is considered direct materials. These are materials that are directly composing the product. Some materials that are not direct materials would be sandpaper used to sand the tables, buffers, stuff like that. Even though they're materials that you use to create the tables, because they're not actually a part of the finished table, they're not considered direct materials. They're considered indirect materials, and they're an indirect cost. Now, the second and only other direct cost is direct labor. So if we consider the direct materials Lego pieces that actually go into the product itself, the direct labor is the person actually putting those Lego pieces together. So these would be the people putting in the legs of the table, screwing in all the screws, all that stuff. So they're actually constructing the products. That's considered direct labor. Now, there may be other laborers within the factory, such as the janitors or the people supervising. However, they're not considered direct labor because they're not directly assembling the product. They're indirect labor. So that brings us to our third main product cost, which is simply just manufacturing overhead. So everything except for direct materials and direct labor is considered an indirect cost, or in other words, overhead. And they're all put together in this giant mass that is just overhead. And the reason is because none of these costs can be directly assigned to each individual product. You know exactly how much it costs on the materials of the product and how much it costs for a worker to assemble a product per hour, but you don't know how much of the cost of a light bulb goes towards each individual table or each individual product. So that's why they're indirect costs and they're considered overhead. Now, overhead is kind of like the prime evil of managerial accounting. It's really confusing and hard to determine. So we have a lot of different things to kind of look at overhead, and that is mainly what you'll be looking at. But with that, these three costs come together to create arguably the most important equation in managerial accounting, which is just what is the total manufacturing cost, or the total cost to manufacture or make a product. And that is simply just direct labor plus direct materials plus manufacturing overhead. So Those are all of the costs found within managerial accounting. Again, you have fixed costs and variable costs, and product costs and period costs.